In the fall of 1863, deep in the remote mountains of West Virginia, something happened that would scar a family forever. On what should have been the happiest night of Martha Carver's life, her wedding night, 4 people were brutally killed in a blood-soaked ritual so disturbing that local authorities rushed to bury every trace of it. For over 150 years, the truth behind that September evening stayed hidden in sealed county records, classified testimony, and the tight-lipped murmurs of a powerful family whose illegal arms dealings fueled both sides of the Civil War. What you're about to hear might change everything you thought you knew about morality during America's darkest chapter. The Carver wedding tradition wasn't just bizarre, it was lethal. And evidence points to similar events happening in other states throughout the 1860s. But before we get deeper into the story of the 9 Carver siblings and the bloody legacy they left behind, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We uncover the disturbing truths American history books avoid. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your state, your town, we'd love to know. Now let's go back to the West Virginia mountains and uncover what really happened. The Carver family lived in a remote compound tucked deep into the hills of what is now Pocahontas County. In 1863, the region was still raw from splitting off from Virginia, and the rocky terrain made it ideal for hiding things the law had no business finding. The Carver siblings, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Caleb, Silas, Abraham, Martha, Rebecca, Judith, and the youngest, Sarah, ran an underground smuggling empire that stretched across 3 states. Their routes followed secret caves, old mining shafts, and forgotten mountain passes. Ezekiel, the oldest, had inherited the timber business and all the shadowy side dealings from their father Morai, who died under strange circumstances in 1859. Locals said Ezekiel could quiet a room with just a look. His brother Jeremiah was known for his violent temper even among hardened mountain men. The sisters were just as fearsome. Martha, aged 28, had already buried 2 husbands under suspicious accidents. Rebecca ran the timber side with cold precision, while Judith controlled a regional spy network. Sarah, barely 19, had a sharp mind her siblings used to win over enemies and seal deals. Their home was no ordinary house. It was a stone fortress surrounded by outbuildings that served the family's criminal empire. But what outsiders never saw were the secret tunnels cut into the mountain itself, used to store weapons and contraband sold to both Confederate and Union buyers. The Carvers didn't care who won the war. They only cared about who paid more. And in the fall of 1863, their wealth, power, and control had never been stronger. During the height of the Civil War, the demand for weapons was relentless, and the Carvers' mountain stronghold was perfectly positioned along key smuggling routes, making them an invaluable asset to military suppliers on both sides. But the higher the profits, the greater the risks, and the Carver family had grown dangerously paranoid, building elaborate systems to protect their secrets and silence anyone who threatened their operation. The wedding that would stain the Carver name forever wasn't born from love, but from strategy. Like many unions in their world, it was a business deal. Martha Carver was set to marry Colonel Bradford Sinclair, a Confederate officer who controlled major supply lines through the Shenandoah Valley. Sinclair, a battle-hardened widower in his 40s, bore scars across his cheek and the calculated pragmatism the Carvers valued. He needed weapons. They needed protection and inside information. The marriage would serve both needs and provide the perfect cover to expand their influence deeper into Virginia and the newly formed state of West Virginia. But Sinclair wasn't the only outsider invited to the celebration. Among the guests was Thomas Hartwell, a federal arms inspector who had been quietly accepting Carver bribes in exchange for turning a blind eye to illegal shipments. Nervous by nature with thinning hair and trembling hands, Hartwell believed he was attending as a friend of the family, unaware that the Carvers had decided his usefulness had run its course. Also present was Dr. Marcus Finch, the family physician and longtime keeper of secrets. He'd treated a suspicious number of so-called accidents over the years and carried more than just medicine in his bag. He kept a ready supply of poisons, sedatives, and herbal mixtures suited to the family's darker needs. The ceremony took place on September 23, 1863, in the Grand Hall of the Carver compound. Reverend Nathan Prescott, a preacher known for bending scripture to suit his audience, officiated. About 30 guests were present, most either related to the family tied to their business or too indebted to refuse the invitation. Martha wore her grandmother's aged silk gown, while Sinclair stood proudly in his Confederate dress uniform, his sword polished and his medals gleaming under the soft light of oil lamps. To an outsider, it might have looked like any high society mountain wedding surrounded by power, wealth, and local influence. But this night was never meant to end with just toasts and celebration. As most of the guests drifted away, a smaller group remained behind. It was then that the Carvers revealed the true purpose of the gathering. The family had long practiced what they called the Sacred Covenant, a secret ritual reserved for pivotal moments, births, deaths, and especially weddings. According to them, this ceremony bound the family in loyalty and ensured unwavering devotion. Colonel Sinclair Hartwell, Dr. Finch, and a select few were invited to take part in what Ezekiel Carver described as an old mountain rite, harmless folklore, meant to welcome the colonel into the family. The reality was far more sinister. In a hidden chamber beneath the main house, lit by flickering candlelight and covered in carvings that blended Celtic, Germanic, and Native American symbols, the ritual began. Some of these markings would baffle historians for years to come. The participants gathered around a large wooden table etched with symbols, each handed a silver cup filled with what the Carvers called mountain wine. The mixture prepared by Dr. Finch included laudanum, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and other herbs meant to strip away inhibitions and induce powerful psychological reactions. Ezekiel spoke in a blend of English and what sounded like an old German dialect, reciting vows of loyalty and secrecy. While the language sounded ancient, later investigations suggested much of it had been invented by the Carvers themselves. Within minutes, the effects of the drug began to show. The effects of the mountain wine hit fast and hard. Those who drank it described waves of euphoria, a drifting sense of time, and a growing openness to whatever suggestions came their way. The boundaries of identity began to dissolve. In this vulnerable state, the Carvers revealed the ritual's real purpose. What had been sold as a harmless family ceremony quickly turned into something darker. The Sacred Covenant wasn't about unity, it was about control. The drug stripped away defenses, leaving each participant exposed mentally and emotionally. One by one, secrets spilled out under Ezekiel's command. No one could resist. First to break was Thomas Hartwell. The federal arms inspector admitted he had been feeding intelligence about the Carver smuggling routes to Union officers, hoping it would buy him immunity. Then came Colonel Sinclair. In a slow, hollow voice, he revealed that his marriage to Martha was a ruse. He'd been ordered to infiltrate the Carvers and gather evidence. His regiment had already begun preparing charges. The bride was just a piece of the plan. Dr. Finch's confession landed like a hammer blow. He had been secretly documenting the family's crimes in a hidden journal, hoping to use it as leverage if he was ever accused. But the real shock came from within the family. Several siblings, intoxicated and unable to filter their words, let slip years of resentment. Private deals with rival gangs, promises to sell out each other, hidden ambitions to seize power within the family. The covenant had backfired. Instead of reinforcing loyalty, it exposed rot at the core. Tension in the chamber skyrocketed. The mixture of drugs and confession created a storm of paranoia and rage. The flickering candlelight danced on the ancient stone walls, casting strange shifting shadows that played tricks on the mind. Jeremiah Carver, already known for his volatility, lost control first. Convinced that spies surrounded them, he seized an iron candlestick and slammed it into Thomas Hartwell's skull. The blow crushed bone with a sickening crunch. Hartwell dropped instantly, his limbs twitching as blood spread across the floor. The sound of it, the impact, the collapse set off a chain reaction. Martha, in her wedding dress, stepped forward without hesitation and drove a hidden blade into Sinclair's side. His mouth opened in a silent gasp as he staggered back, red, staining his crisp uniform. Shock was etched across his face as he fell. Dr. Finch bolted for the stairs, panic on his face, but Caleb and Abraham grabbed him before he reached the exit. Convinced he was about to betray them all, Caleb tightened his grip around the doctor's throat, while Abraham bludgeoned him with a brass oil lamp until his body went limp. Colonel Sinclair, still clinging to life, managed to draw his sword. With the last of his strength, he swung wildly, the blade slicing Judith's arm as she lunged toward him. Blood sprayed the stone wall behind her, bright red against the carved symbols. The sacred chamber that had once felt mystical was now a slaughterhouse. The line between ritual and massacre had vanished. Judith's scream, sharp with pain and fury, triggered something primal in the rest of the Carver siblings. Like wolves closing in on wounded prey, they descended on the dying Confederate officer. What followed was pure chaos. The stone chamber, once the stage for a twisted ritual, erupted into a frenzy of violence. Blood sprayed across the carved symbols on the walls, and the air filled with the sickly sweet stench of smoke, blood, and death. The candles flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows as the mountain wine surged through everyone's veins, heightening the horror and warping reality until it felt like they were trapped inside a shared hallucination from which there was no escape. Ezekiel Carver, the one who had meticulously planned every moment of the ceremony, now stood powerless. His grand design to bind the family in loyalty had collapsed into a night of uncontrollable bloodshed. He had wanted unity. What he got was madness, and as he watched his siblings tear into guests and each other, it became clear that some forces once unleashed couldn't be pulled back. So what really drove this family to such savage extremes? Was it just the drug coursing through their blood? Or had something darker always lived beneath the surface? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this unsettling corner of forgotten American history has you hooked, be sure to hit that like button. By the time the chaos subsided, 4 people lay dead on the cold stone floor. Their blood pooled in thick, dark puddles glinting in the low candlelight. But the nightmare wasn't over. Now came the part that even the Carvers dreaded cleaning up. As dawn crept over the West Virginia hills, the true weight of the massacre became clear. The chamber was a slaughterhouse. Signs of drug use, ritualistic symbols, and brutal violence were everywhere. There was no way this could be spun as an accident. And so, with the lingering fog of the mountain wine still dulling their senses, the surviving Carvers did what they had always done. When faced with unspeakable choices, they acted. Ezekiel, battered, but still calculating, quickly took charge. The first priority was removing the bodies and erasing all traces of what had happened. Years of running illegal shipments through mountain trails and hidden caves had taught them how to move quietly and cover their tracks. They knew every dead-end shaft and forgotten passage in those hills. Dr. Finch's medical bag ironically proved useful, even in death. The chemicals and tools he'd brought for healing or harm were now used to help destroy evidence. They also tapped into their access to quicklime from their limestone quarry, using it to speed decomposition and ensure the bodies would never be identified. But Colonel Sinclair presented a far greater challenge. Unlike the others, he wasn't some shady associate or local informant. He was a high-ranking Confederate officer, and his disappearance would spark an immediate investigation. Military men didn't just vanish without someone asking questions. So the Carvers crafted a cover story. They forged letters, planted misleading evidence, and created the illusion that Sinclair had abandoned his post and run off with his bride, planning to escape the crumbling war by fleeing south, perhaps to Mexico. It was a risky lie, but it wasn't unheard of. By 1863, plenty of Confederate officers had already deserted, and with the war turning against them, the idea wasn't far-fetched. Martha, despite having stabbed her husband through the ribs with a ceremonial blade just hours earlier, played her role with chilling ease. Tearful, heartbroken, and utterly convincing, she painted herself as a woman scorned and left behind. Martha claimed that Sinclair had received urgent orders in the middle of the night and left before dawn, taking with him several valuable possessions and promising to send for her once he'd established himself elsewhere. Her performance was so believable, even some of her siblings began to doubt what they had witnessed. Over the next 3 days, the family focused on erasing every trace of what had occurred. They scrubbed the ritual chamber until their hands bled. The bloodstains that wouldn't lift were painted over. The wooden table was smashed and burned. The symbols chiseled into the stone walls were defaced and replaced with meaningless patterns. Even the silver ritual cups were melted down, reforged into mundane items to ensure they could never be recognized. But cleaning the room was the easy part. The real problem was the people who had survived. Everyone who'd been in that chamber carried scars, mental, emotional, and in some cases, spiritual. The mountain wine left their memories broken and scattered with long gaps and blurred sequences. No one could say for sure what happened first, who struck whom, or how the deaths unfolded. That ambiguity offered some protection, but it also led to contradictions that made the family's cover story harder to sustain. And in time, it would come back to haunt them. Decades later, something would be unearthed in those same mountains, something that proved the Carvers' crimes went far deeper than one night of bloodshed. But before we get there, we need to understand how the family began to unravel from within. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, share it with a friend who loves buried history and brutal mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe to stay with us as we peel back every disturbing layer. Now let's keep going. In the months after the wedding massacre, cracks began forming in the Carver family's empire. The trauma of what they had done, combined with the constant fear of exposure, poisoned everything. Their criminal operation, once held together by tight control and cold calculation, began to rot from the inside. Trust among the siblings, already thin, completely collapsed. Jeremiah Carver, the one who struck first, suffered the worst effects. He was tormented by nightmares so vivid, he would wake screaming, unable to separate memory from dream. During the day, he grew increasingly unstable. He'd fall into long silences, staring at his own hands as if they were still covered in blood. At meetings, he'd suddenly lash out, accusing associates of being spies, traitors, or informants. No one felt safe around him, not even his brothers. Martha spiraled in a different direction. She became convinced that her murdered husband's ghost still haunted the compound. She began holding secret rituals to appease him, burning his uniform, whispering apologies into empty rooms, leaving plates of food in corners where she swore she'd seen his shadow. Her obsession grew to the point where she refused to sleep in the main house and began spending nights in the old root cellar, where she claimed his spirit was strongest. Meanwhile, their business was unraveling. The Carvers grew paranoid, turning away profitable deals and shutting out longtime partners because they suspected everyone of betrayal. Their network of informants collapsed under the weight of their own distrust. They severed ties, canceled shipments, and ended contracts with no warning. By spring 1864, they were bleeding money. The war was winding down. Demand for weapons dropped fast, and the Carvers were stuck with massive stockpiles they couldn't move. Their timber operation, which once masked their illegal trade, was also struggling, as military projects were canceled and private construction dried up. But the real threat wasn't the economy, it was the investigation. The disappearance of Thomas Hartwell had caught the attention of Union intelligence. Though the Carvers had destroyed all physical evidence of his death, they couldn't erase his financial records. Investigators discovered payments from Carver shell companies and traced Hartwell's last known movements straight to the compound. The case was assigned to Captain William Sterling, a former Philadelphia detective turned wartime intelligence officer. Known for his patience and refusal to be intimidated, Sterling had made a name for himself rooting out Confederate saboteurs and corrupt government contractors. And now, he had his sights set on the Carvers. Captain William Sterling began his investigation with the financial trail left behind by Thomas Hartwell. The records didn't lie. Hartwell's income far exceeded his government salary, with unexplained deposits and suspicious expenditures that aligned perfectly with the timing of several illegal arms shipments in the region. The deeper Sterling dug, the more connections he uncovered, links that tied multiple families and businesses in the West Virginia mountains to corruption and smuggling. At the top of his list were the Carvers. His arrival in Pocahontas County in June 1864 sent shockwaves through the Carver compound. Unlike local sheriffs who could be paid off or threatened into silence, Sterling carried the full weight of federal authority. He had the power to interrogate witnesses, seize documents, and search any property suspected of aiding enemy forces. And the Carvers knew that once he set his sights on something, he didn't stop. Ezekiel Carver agreed to meet with him twice. Calm and measured Ezekiel portrayed himself as nothing more than a legitimate businessman who occasionally dealt in surplus equipment. He claimed to have been just as surprised by Hartwell's disappearance as anyone else, suggesting that the inspector had seemed agitated and paranoid during their final meeting months earlier. But Sterling had spent his career watching liars squirm. He read between the lines. He noticed the inconsistencies in Ezekiel's timeline, the missing paperwork, the nervous glances exchanged between family members. Something was off. Then came the threats. Several former federal employees who had worked alongside Hartwell confessed they'd received warnings to steer clear of the Carvers, warnings that came with implied consequences. For Sterling, that confirmed what he already suspected: the Carvers were dangerous, organized, and operating at a level far beyond local corruption. Things escalated when he began digging into the disappearance of Colonel Bradford Sinclair, the story of a Confederate officer deserting his post immediately after marrying Martha Carver and vanishing the same night Hartwell was last seen, wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. When Sterling questioned Martha, she crumbled. Her story changed with every version. She fidgeted, stumbled over names, and avoided eye contact. For a woman supposedly mourning her missing husband, her answers lacked conviction, and her performance didn't fool the captain. By late summer, Sterling had built a damning case. While he still lacked direct evidence of murder, he had more than enough to prove the Carvers were guilty of arms trafficking, bribery, and treason. Arrest warrants were being prepared, and there was little doubt the siblings would be convicted and likely executed for their crimes. The Carvers knew the clock was ticking. They had survived the aftermath of the wedding night slaughter. But now they faced something they couldn't hide from a federal investigation led by a man they couldn't manipulate or buy. And so, in a final act of desperation, they made a decision that would cement their legacy in American folklore. In August 1864, with Sterling preparing to arrest all 9 siblings. The Carvers launched what they called the Final Covenant, a last-ditch plan to erase everything. The strategy was as audacious as it was deadly. They would stage a massive explosion at the compound, destroying their ammunition stockpiles and all incriminating evidence along with them. The blast would be made to look like an accident, a catastrophic detonation that claimed the lives of the entire Carver family. No trials, no confessions, no bodies left to interrogate. The Carvers had access to enormous stockpiles of black powder and explosives through their smuggling operation, and they knew every inch of their underground storage system. They understood exactly how to stage an explosion that would look like an accident. But despite the magnitude of what they planned, the family never intended to die in the blast. Their real goal was escape. The explosion was a smokescreen, one final trick to fool the federal government, while they vanished into the mountains headed for Mexico, where other Confederate sympathizers had already fled to avoid prosecution. All summer long, the Carvers had quietly prepared. They funneled cache weapons and gold into caches scattered throughout the wilderness, packing maps, forged documents, and survival gear. They didn't trust anyone outside the bloodline. They were planning to vanish and erase their legacy with fire and thunder. But even as they made their final preparations, the psychological toll of the wedding night massacre was becoming undeniable. Jeremiah Carver, the most unstable of the siblings, insisted on returning to the underground ritual chamber one last time. He claimed he had to complete the covenant, as if the ghosts of the men they had killed were demanding closure. The others begged him not to go, but his volatility made them too afraid to stop him. On the night of August 15th, 1864, Jeremiah disappeared into the caves beneath the compound. By dawn, he still hadn't returned. His brothers went down to search for him and found a scene that would scar them for life. Jeremiah's body was sprawled on the stone floor of the old chamber, surrounded by melted candles and a half-finished bowl of the hallucinogenic mountain wine. He had carved the names of their victims into his own chest and arms with a knife. Blood had pooled around him. The names were jagged and deep. He had bled out alone in the dark, haunted by everything they had done. With Jeremiah dead, the Carvers had no choice but to accelerate their plan. Captain Sterling was closing in. Investigators were ready to search the property. The evidence they had hidden for years was at risk of being uncovered. They couldn't afford to wait. That night, Ezekiel, Martha, and the remaining siblings gathered for what they believed would be their final moments in the mountains they had ruled for so long. They set their charges with precision, and when everything was in place, they lit the fuse. On August 16th, 1864, just before sunrise, the mountains shook. The explosion that tore through the Carver compound was so massive that windows shattered over 5 miles away. Witnesses as far as Virginia reported hearing it. The blast sent a column of flame hundreds of feet into the sky. The main house was obliterated. Smoke and ash blanketed the valley. What remained was a crater deep black and still burning at the edges. Captain Sterling arrived with his team at first light. He expected a crime scene. What he found was something far worse. The explosion had destroyed most of the known compound, but it had also exposed previously hidden sections of the underground chambers. As investigators moved through the wreckage, they uncovered human remains bones that had clearly been buried long before the fire. Skulls were cracked. Ribs were broken. Several had knife marks. These weren't victims of the explosion. They were victims of murder. And the bones weren't buried in coffins. They had been dumped and concealed in hidden corners of the tunnels. Then came the final shock: Jeremiah's body. His corpse was found deep in the ruined ritual chamber, still surrounded by the remnants of his final ceremony. The carvings in his flesh, the still visible occult symbols on the chamber walls, and the location of his death all pointed to something far darker than illegal weapons sales. Sterling didn't just see a failed criminal empire. He saw a cult, a pattern of systematic killings, possibly even cannibalism, stretching back years. But even with these discoveries, one thing was missing the rest of the Carvers. No bodies, no blood trails, nothing to suggest they died in the blast. The pattern of destruction suggested the explosion had been executed with technical precision, likely planned by someone who knew how to shape the force of the blast and ensure a clear escape route. Sterling's suspicions grew. This wasn't an accident. This was a disappearing act. The investigation dragged on for months. But with the war nearing its end, federal priorities shifted. Rebuilding the country came first. Chasing the shadows of a supposedly dead family didn't rank high on the list. Without living suspects or undeniable evidence of their crimes, the case stalled. The official report listed the Carver's siblings as casualties of an accidental munitions detonation. Case closed. But the people of Pocahontas County never accepted that version of events. In the years that followed, stories spread. Campers and hunters spoke of strange lights moving through the woods at night, of distant cries echoing through the trees of being watched by unseen eyes near the old smuggling trails. Locals whispered that the Carvers had escaped, that they had survived. Some said they were still out there hiding in the mountains, guarding secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. Over time, the Carver name became more than just a family. It became a warning. In towns across the Appalachian frontier, parents used their story to scare children straight. To speak of the Carvers was to speak of evil, of what happens when greed and bloodlust outweigh morality and kinship. What Captain Sterling never learned was that 5 of the 9 Carver siblings had indeed survived the explosion and crossed the border into Mexico, just as they had planned. Martha, Rebecca, Judith, Sarah, and Abraham slipped into new lives using forged identities and carefully hidden assets. But escaping justice didn't mean escaping guilt. The bonds that once held them together as a family shattered under the weight of what they had done. Within 2 years, the cracks became fatal. Sarah was found dead in a hotel room, poisoned. No suspect was ever identified. Rebecca vanished during a trip to California and was never seen again. Martha, burdened by the murder of her husband and the trail of blood left in her name, retreated into religion. She joined a convent in Mexico and spent the rest of her life trying to atone, dying in 1889, with whispered nightmares still haunting her sleep. Judith built a new life in Texas, running a modest business under an alias. She never married, never had children, and never spoke of her past. But her neighbors reported she often woke screaming, muttering about candles and blood. Abraham was the only one who truly reinvented himself. In Arizona territory, he became a respected rancher and later a legislator. He played the part of a self-made man. But in private, he kept journals hundreds of pages that revealed a soul unraveling under the weight of inherited sin. In his writings discovered after his death in 1904, Abraham confessed that the wedding night massacre hadn't been a singular outburst. According to him, it was merely the final chapter in a long and secret tradition. The sacred covenant ritual had been practiced for years, possibly decades. Beneath the Carver compound lay the remains of at least 15 people. Some were rivals. Some were partners. Some were relatives. All were victims of the same drug-fueled ceremonies that always ended in blood. And what's worse, Abraham believed they weren't the only ones. He wrote that other criminal families throughout the Appalachian region had adopted similar rituals during the chaos of the Civil War. With law enforcement stretched thin and opium flowing freely from military and medical stores, isolated mountain communities had become breeding grounds for cult-like violence disguised as loyalty. Just when we thought the nightmare was over, the story of the Carvers took a darker turn. If this tale has left your skin crawling, share it with someone who loves true crime and buried history. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. We're not done yet. In 1923, nearly 60 years after the explosion that supposedly ended the Carver legacy, a coal mining crew in Pocahontas County made a discovery that ripped open the past. While digging a new shaft, workers broke into an untouched section of the old Carver tunnels, somehow preserved beneath the collapsed debris. Inside, investigators found a chamber sealed away since the Civil War. What they uncovered matched Abraham Carver's confessions almost word for word. There in the cold, dry dark were the ritual carvings, the symbols, the blood-stained stones, and the bones arranged in unnatural patterns, some still bearing the marks of knives, fractures, and fire. Dozens of items were recovered. Rusted silver cups, melted candle remnants, and traces of the mountain wine mixture preserved in broken glass vessels. The truth had been buried for decades, but it refused to stay silent. Human bones lay scattered across the chamber floor, each one bearing unmistakable signs of violence, cracked skulls, slashed ribs, trauma no accident could explain. Mixed in were the remnants of ritual tools, drug-making instruments, and carved symbols that matched the exact descriptions noted in the 1860s federal case files. But it was what investigators found buried in a rusted metal lockbox that truly stunned the nation. Inside were detailed records of the Carver family's crimes, meticulous logs of illegal transactions, lists of victims' dates, and chilling notes that aligned precisely with the family's so-called sacred covenant ceremonies. The 1923 discovery exploded across the country. Newspapers called it the most horrifying crime syndicate in American history. The Carvers were branded as mountain devils, demons in human form who had used isolation war and fear to hide a network of ritualistic violence for decades. The timing was perfect for public obsession. America in the Roaring '20s was captivated by stories of outlaws, bootleggers, and moral corruption. But the Carver story stood apart because it wasn't just about crime. It was about blood belief and a darkness that spanned generations. What made the discovery even more terrifying was how far the Carver influence had reached. The documents revealed that their criminal activities had gone well beyond weapons smuggling. The family had been involved in human trafficking, coordinated assassinations, and the systemic bribery of public officials in at least 5 states. Letters and financial ledgers in the lockup box pointed to something even bigger, a multi-family criminal organization that operated across the Appalachian region during the Civil War. These families, like the Carvers, had used drugs and rituals to control their members and silence potential witnesses. The infamous Wedding Night Massacre was no isolated incident. It was one ritual among many, part of a broader pattern of violence that had claimed dozens of lives across multiple states. As state authorities reopened long-forgotten records and compared them with the evidence recovered in 1923, they noticed something chilling. In Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, certain prominent families had histories littered with mysterious deaths, vanished neighbors, and sudden wealth. While nothing could be proven, the similarities to the Carver case were too precise to ignore. Worse still, investigators discovered that some descendants of these families had risen to powerful positions: judges, business magnates, politicians. There was no proof they had continued the crimes of their ancestors, but many had curiously opposed efforts to preserve Civil War-era archives or reopen cold cases. It was as if they feared the past being unearthed. Then, in 1952, the final chapter of the Carver mystery surfaced half a continent away. Mexican authorities reached out to American officials with a deathbed confession from an elderly woman named Maria Esperanza. She had been a housekeeper at a convent in Mexico City, and in her final days, she revealed that one of the nuns she had cared for had once been one of America's most wanted fugitives. That woman's name was Martha Carver. According to Mariah, Martha had lived quietly for years, consumed by guilt, haunted by visions she could not escape. In her final months, she confessed everything. The arms dealing the murders, the truth about her husband's death, and the ceremonies that had turned their family into monsters. But what shocked investigators most was the origin of the sacred covenant ritual itself. Martha claimed the rite hadn't come from family tradition. It had been taught to them by a traveling occultist. This stranger had wandered through mountain communities in the 1850s, offering forbidden knowledge to anyone desperate or ruthless enough to accept it. He promised power, secrecy, and unity through ritual at a cost. Martha couldn't recall his name, but she remembered his eyes, cold, ageless, and not of this world. She claimed he never aged, and that she had heard rumors he'd taught similar rites in other towns, sowing seeds of violence that would blossom in the chaos of war. Whether that occultist was real or a figment of Martha's unraveling mind, we may never know. But what's certain is this: the Carver family legacy didn't die in 1864. It hid, rotted, and whispered through history until the land itself finally gave up its secrets. And in doing so, it left behind the chilling reminder that some horrors don't disappear. They just wait to be found. According to Martha's deathbed confession as relayed by Maria Esperanza, the ritual practices of the Carver family weren't born in those West Virginia mountains. They were imported. The mysterious occultist who first introduced the sacred covenant to the family had allegedly traveled through Europe and Asia, collecting rites and substances from ancient cults and shadowy sects before bringing his twisted knowledge to the remote hollows of Appalachia. His teachings became the blueprint for the Carvers' ceremonies and eventually their destruction. Martha also revealed the final grisly fates of her surviving siblings. Rebecca, she claimed, was murdered by Judith during an argument over stolen money. Sarah, unable to live with the guilt any longer, had threatened to return to the United States and confess everything. For that, Abraham poisoned her. Even in exile, their paranoia remained stronger than any bond. They didn't escape justice. They simply turned it inward and destroyed one another. Maria provided American investigators with Martha's written confession, a silver locket containing faded photographs of all 9 Carver siblings and a sealed vial of what she claimed was a preserved sample of the mountain wine. When analyzed, the contents matched historical witness descriptions, a potent mixture of opium, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and other psychoactive compounds designed to dissolve inhibitions and fuel obedience. The science confirmed what history had long whispered: the Carvers had chemically engineered their rituals to break the mind and bind the will. Today, the site where the Carver compound once stood is marked by a small, unassuming plaque. It doesn't mention murder ritual or cult activity. It simply reads, "Site of a tragic Civil War-era explosion, dedicated to the memory of those lost." For decades, local historians have fought to update the language to tell the public the truth. But the state continues to refuse, citing a lack of definitive proof and a desire not to sensationalize history. But others believe the reluctance runs deeper. In the 1970s, Dr. Elela Nena Piton, a criminologist at West Virginia University, began a sweeping investigation into Civil War-era organized crime. Her research led her straight into the shadow cast by the Carver family. Dr. Piton uncovered evidence of coordinated violence ritual practices and widespread corruption linked to several prominent families whose names still carried political weight in Appalachia. Her manuscript, though unfinished at the time of her death in 1995, painted a damning picture: generations of silence, systemic cover-ups, and deliberate historical revisionism to protect reputations and inherited power. Dr. Piton's work wasn't just theoretical. Using archaeological fieldwork and ground-penetrating radar, she identified at least 12 additional sites across 4 Appalachian states. Each location shared eerie similarities: underground chambers carved into remote hillsides or beneath old estates. Ceremonial artifacts remains bearing signs of trauma and remnants of ritual drug mixtures. These weren't isolated events. This was a pattern. This was organized. She concluded that the sacred covenant, or variations of it, had likely been practiced by a clandestine network of criminal families during the Civil War. The chaos of wartime had allowed them to thrive. Rival gangs disappeared, whistleblowers vanished, and local authorities were too distracted to intervene. The rituals were used not only for internal loyalty, but also as tools of fear execution and psychological control. Her findings suggested that after the war, many of these families maintained contact through business deals, strategic marriages, and political alliances. The web stayed intact. Though Dr. Peaton never publicly named these families, she noted that many of them had descendants in high-ranking roles across local government, state legislatures, banking institutions, and corporate boards. When she began to share her findings, she received threats. Her university funding was withdrawn. Her research team was disbanded. Officially, the project was deemed unsubstantiated and shelved. But the truth lingered in her notes, in her interviews, and in the unearthed bones scattered beneath the hills. The most unsettling takeaway from Dr. Peaton's work wasn't that the Carvers had existed. It was that they might not have been an anomaly. They may have been part of something larger. A secret America beneath the surface of the Civil War. A network of blood ritual and power that helped shape the nation in the shadows. And perhaps in quiet corners of Appalachia, in shuttered old houses and forgotten mines, echoes of the sacred covenant still remain waiting, watching and whispering across the hills. The Carver family's influence didn't end with their violent legacy in West Virginia or their mysterious escape to the Southwest. By the 1890s, law enforcement officials across the western frontier began to notice troubling patterns: ritualistic killings, organized corruption, and tightly controlled criminal groups using fear and psychological manipulation to maintain power. While investigators couldn't always tie these new organizations directly to the Carvers, the similarities in their tactics were too precise to ignore. Their methods had spread. Detective William Hayes of the New Mexico Territorial Police compiled a series of investigations between 1887 and 1894 that exposed a disturbing trend. He documented at least 6 criminal organizations in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona that practiced what he called covenant ceremonies, drug-fueled rituals used to secure loyalty and silence potential traitors. These ceremonies bore a striking resemblance to the sacred covenant described in the old Carver records. Hayes's most detailed case centered on the Brennan family of Colorado. Ostensibly silver mine owners, the Brennans ran their empire through a blend of legitimate business and systematic violence. According to Hayes, the family's control methods mirrored those of the Carvers, down to the drug recipes and the ceremonial elements. Victims were often found with identical signs of ritual mutilation, and the Brennans were rumored to have learned their techniques from a traveler who had once worked with mountain families during the Civil War, a chilling echo of the unnamed occultist Martha Carver, described decades earlier. But in 1895, just as Hayes seemed close to revealing something much larger, he was found dead in his Santa Fe hotel room. Official reports ruled it a suicide, claiming he had overdosed on laudanum and suffered from stress and personal debt. But those close to him painted a different picture. Hayes had been upbeat in his final days, enthusiastic about breakthroughs in his cases, and had even scheduled interviews for the following week. His sudden death raised eyebrows, but no investigation was ever opened. Worse, his files were immediately seized by territorial authorities and classified under the umbrella of ongoing criminal inquiries. When New Mexico became a state in 1912, those same records were said to have been lost during a bureaucratic reshuffling. Some historians, however, believe they were deliberately destroyed to protect individuals who had risen to political power, possibly descendants or associates of the very criminal families Hayes had been investigating. As this shadowy chapter of American history draws to a close, it leaves behind more questions than answers. Were the Carvers just one depraved family operating in the chaos of war, or were they part of a larger network that evolved into something resembling modern organized crime? Based on the evidence, it seems likely that they weren't alone. The breakdown of order during the Civil War opened the door for violent, opportunistic families to thrive. With weapons, drugs, and desperate people readily available, the perfect conditions existed for the rise of criminal systems built on fear and control. What makes the Carver story especially disturbing is not just what they did, but what they may have started. The rituals, the drugs, the philosophy of absolute loyalty through psychological domination. It didn't die with them. There are strong signs it was passed down, repackaged, and woven into other families, other names, and perhaps even other institutions. The legacy of the Carvers isn't just buried in the mountains of West Virginia. It may still be echoing across America, hiding behind respectability, wealth, and power. The ritualistic nature of the Carver family's crimes, combined with their calculated elimination of witnesses and their ability to cultivate corrupt officials, revealed a disturbing level of sophistication rarely seen in that era. If families like the Carvers did in fact form alliances, networks built on shared methods, mutual protection, and inherited secrecy, and if those networks managed to survive into the modern age, then a large portion of American political and economic history might need to be re-examined. The wealth accumulated during the Civil War, the political dynasties that rose from its ashes, and even the structures of influence that still shape our society today, could have darker roots than we've been taught to believe. The efforts to suppress this history, the deaths of researchers, the vanished documents, the closed-door denials, suggest that someone believes the truth is dangerous enough to kill for. The fact that these efforts have persisted for more than 150 years implies that the consequences of exposing the Carver legacy are not just historical, they're current. Then came a final clue. In 1889, 25 years after the explosion that supposedly ended the Carver family, a dying man arrived at a small Catholic mission in El Paso, Texas. His name was Thomas Hartwell, Jr., the son of the federal arms inspector murdered during the infamous Wedding Night Massacre. According to Father Miguel Rodriguez, the mission priest who recorded his confession, Hartwell Jr. had spent his life chasing ghosts, trailing the surviving Carver's siblings across the American Southwest, and gathering evidence of the crimes they continued to commit. What he discovered changed everything. Abraham Carver, once believed to have reformed and built a respectable life as a rancher and legislator in Arizona Territory, was in truth the architect of something far worse. Drawing from the tactics his family had perfected during the war, he built a criminal empire, one that cloaked itself in legitimacy while practicing a refined version of the sacred covenant ritual. The core elements remained drug-induced trance states, ritualized killings, and the systematic removal of anyone who posed a threat to the organization. In his confession, Hartwell detailed at least 8 such incidents between 1867 and 1885. Murders staged to look like accidents or pinned on innocent scapegoats. Victims included rival businessmen, incorruptible government officials, and even Carver's own associates when they showed signs of weakness or disloyalty. Most disturbing of all, Abraham had not acted alone. He had taught the covenant method to other families, expanding the ritual into a network that reached across the territories. These families protected each other, shared intelligence, and reinforced their power through fear, secrecy, and murder. The massacre in West Virginia had not marked the end of the Carver influence. It had been the beginning of something far more organized and dangerous. According to Father Rodriguez, Hartwell died peacefully after delivering his confession. With him was a weathered leather satchel filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be preserved samples of the drug mixture used in the Carver rituals. Rodriguez intended to hand the materials over to the authorities. But just days later, a fire tore through the mission. The records were lost. Whether the blaze was an accident or arson, no one could say for certain. But the priest noted in his final journal entry that strangers had been asking about Hartwell in the days before the fire, and they hadn't come to pray. Today, the full truth of the Carver family remains buried in dusty archives, forgotten journals, and whispered rumors. Theirs is a chapter most historians avoid, not because of lack of evidence, but because the implications are too disturbing, too dangerous. The final confirmed sighting of any Carver was in 1891, when a woman matching Martha's description was seen entering a convent in Guadalajara. She carried nothing but a small leather bag and refused to speak her name. And with that, the last known shadow of the Carver legacy vanished into silence. By 1895, every known trace of the surviving Carver siblings had vanished. Abraham Carver's Arizona businesses were quietly sold to anonymous buyers, while the underground network he built disappeared without explanation. The territorial officials once rumored to be under his influence either died in sudden unexplained accidents or left the region entirely, taking their secrets with them. The wedding night massacre in the West Virginia mountains had claimed 4 lives that night. But according to Thomas Hartwell Jr.'s deathbed confession, the true body count stretched far beyond that. Over the next 30 years, dozens more would die in silence, sacrificed in the name of a ritual that began with blood and ended in darkness. What makes the Carver legacy so disturbing isn't just the violence. It's the sophistication. Their use of drugs to manipulate behavior, ritualized killings to enforce loyalty, and systemic corruption to shield themselves from prosecution. All of it mirrored practices that wouldn't become mainstream in organized crime until decades later. In many ways, the Carvers weren't just a violent family hiding in the hills. They were pioneers, early architects of the modern criminal underworld. And while their underground chambers in West Virginia were sealed shut after the 1923 archaeological investigation, the techniques developed within those stone walls found new life elsewhere, carried westward with migrants, outlaws, and opportunists. The sacred covenant ritual, equal parts psychological warfare and ritual violence, proved highly effective in maintaining control and eliminating threats. In towns and counties once touched by the Carver influence, stories of curses and haunted wedding nights were passed down through generations. Children in parts of West Virginia, Arizona, and Texas still recite old rhymes and sing eerie songs about a bride in white and a groom who vanished in fire. Most don't know the origins, but someone always did. The physical evidence of the Carver family's crimes has long since been lost, destroyed, buried, or erased. But their legacy lingers in whispers and shadows. The massacre of 1863 was not just an ending. It was the ignition point of a much broader story that sprawled across decades and territories, reaching countless lives, many of whom never knew they were part of the ripple effect that began in that stone chamber beneath the mountains. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Carver name faded from headlines and public memory. But for those who looked closely, for those who knew what questions to ask, the fingerprints remained. In certain criminal organizations across the American West and Southwest, in the patterns of silence, fear, and ritualistic violence, the DNA of the Carver philosophy could still be seen. The sacred covenant that once bound 9 siblings in loyalty and blood may have died with them, but the ideology behind it lived on. New names, new faces, same darkness. What started as a twisted family tradition became a blueprint for something far more widespread and enduring. And perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is this evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears respectability. Sometimes it builds churches, funds town halls, and passes laws. The Carver story reminds us that beneath the surface of history, some of the darkest chapters remain unwritten, erased, hidden, or deliberately forgotten. So what do you think? Could a family like the Carvers have really operated so successfully under the radar? In 19th century America, could their influence have shaped the underpinnings of power and crime in ways we've never fully understood? Let us know in the comments. And if this tale of historical horror shook you, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share it with someone who isn't afraid to face the darker truths of our nation's past. The dead may rest in silence, but their stories never stay buried for long.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.